Dr. Patricia Sullivan's latex gloves froze mid-incision, her scalpel suspended above the gaping wound as her eyes widened behind surgical glasses. The operating room fell into absolute silence, except for the steady beep of monitors. It wasn't the sebaceous cyst they'd expected to find inside Edward Hartford's 6-year growth. A surgical nurse stumbled backward, her instrument tray clattering to the sterile floor as metallic objects scattered across white tiles. The anesthesiologist's hands trembled as he checked Edward's vitals twice, unable to process what lay exposed before them. 74-year-old Edward had carried this secret for decades, greeting his beloved hardware store customers each day, never knowing the gentle shopkeeper harbored something impossible beneath his carefully combed silver hair. The man who'd helped 3 generations repair their homes had been hiding evidence of a life they couldn't imagine. "Dear God," Dr. Sullivan whispered, backing away from the table. "How is this even possible? What had Edward Hartford been concealing all these years, and why was it surfacing now?" Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Edward James Hartford had perfected the art of invisibility in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. At 74, the former owner of Millfield Hardware had transformed from the man who once sponsored the Little League team into someone who slipped through shadows, timing his rare outings for the empty hours just after dawn. The Victorian house on Maple Street, where he'd lived for 35 years with his late wife, Margaret, had become his fortress. Paint peeled from his shutters like old skin, and the vegetable garden Margaret had tended with such pride now grew wild and untamed. Edward preferred it that way. Less attention, fewer questions about why the man who'd once been known for his impeccable appearance now wore baseball caps, even in the sweltering Ohio summers. The lump had started innocently enough, a small bump behind his left ear that he dismissed as another indignity of aging. But as months turned to years, the growth had developed a mind of its own, expanding like a secret that refused to stay buried. Edward's days followed a rigid pattern designed to avoid human contact. Morning coffee with Margaret's photograph, afternoon television that reminded him of simpler times, evening phone calls that never came from a daughter who'd built a life 2,000 miles away and seemed content to keep it that way. Sarah Hartford, his only child, was 45 and thriving as a physician in Denver. Their relationship had cooled to obligatory holiday cards and birthday phone calls that grew shorter each year. She'd stopped visiting after Margaret's funeral 3 years ago, claiming work demanded her attention. Edward suspected the truth was more complicated, that his grief made her uncomfortable. The financial reality gnawed at Edward like a persistent ache. His Social Security and small pension covered the basics, but Medicare's gaps felt like canyons when facing potential medical bills. The house represented his only real security. He'd rather suffer in silence than risk losing the home where he'd raised Sarah and nursed Margaret through her final illness. Neighbor Frank Thompson, the only person who still attempted regular contact, had grown increasingly suspicious of Edward's hermit-like behavior. "Ed, when's the last time you came to the Legion Hall?" he'd call through the screen door. But Edward had perfected the art of being perpetually busy whenever Frank appeared with concerned expressions. What Frank couldn't see was how Edward's simple morning routine of combing his silver hair had become an exercise in careful positioning, strategic angles, and the growing certainty that whatever was growing beneath his skin carried secrets that went far deeper than anyone could imagine. The community center incident. The mandatory Medicare enrollment meeting at Millfield Community Center arrived like a summons Edward couldn't ignore. He spent an hour arranging and rearranging the baseball cap that had become his armor. The lump, now roughly the size of a tennis ball, defied concealment. Halfway through the presentation, Edward felt the warm wetness against his neck. The lump had begun to weep. He pressed his hand to his cap, feeling the moisture seep through. "Mr. Hartford." The voice belonged to Janet Mills, whose daughter had bought supplies from his store for years. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." Edward forced a smile, keeping his hand pressed against his neck. "Just warm in here." But as he spoke, he felt more fluid, and the metallic scent that had been haunting him for weeks seemed stronger. By the time he reached the hallway, blood was visible. "Oh, my lord," gasped Betty Whitman, the church organist. "Edward, you're bleeding." The hallway erupted in concerned voices. "Someone call 911. What is that thing?" Edward ran through the community center doors and down Maple Street toward home, leaving behind a room full of shocked neighbors and a blood-stained floor. He didn't stop until he reached his front door and collapsed inside. For 3 days, Edward refused to answer his door or phone. On the 4th day, Frank Thompson made the call Edward had been dreading. "Sarah, it's Frank, your dad's neighbor. Honey, you need to come home. Something's wrong with Edward, and I don't think he's got much time to argue about it." Sarah's arrival. Sarah Hartford was in the middle of hospital rounds when her phone rang. She almost ignored it, but something made her excuse herself and take the call. 26 hours later, she stood on her childhood front porch using the key Edward had hidden under the same flower pot for 30 years. She found her father in Margaret's old recliner, wearing a bathrobe at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "Dad." The man who turned toward her was barely recognizable. Edward had always been proud of his appearance. This person was hollow-eyed, rail-thin, and wearing a cap indoors in October. "You didn't need to come," Edward said, his voice carrying exhaustion. "Frank had no right to call you." Sarah pulled up a chair and sat facing her father for the first time in 2 years. "Dad, when's the last time you ate a real meal? This isn't living. This is dying in slow motion." Edward's hand went instinctively to his neck, adjusting the cap. "I've managed fine for 74 years. Look at yourself. When's the last time you looked in a mirror?" The silence stretched until Edward finally spoke. "I haven't looked at myself, really looked in 6 years." The confrontation reached its breaking point when Sarah gently reached toward Edward's cap. He recoiled as if she'd struck him. "Don't," he whispered. "Please don't." But Sarah had seen enough. "Dad, I'm going to ask you something. How long has this been going on?" Edward's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he pulled the cap away, revealing the mass that had consumed the left side of his neck. 6 years, he whispered. "Maybe a little more." Sarah was already reaching for her phone. "We're going to the doctor today, right now." "Sarah, honey, you don't understand. The money. I don't care about the money." "Dad, this thing is bigger than a softball." The doctor's office. Dr. James Mitchell had been the Hartford family physician for 15 years. When Edward removed his cap in the examination room, even his professional composure wavered. "Edward," he said softly, "this should have been addressed years ago." The examination revealed that the mass was firm, irregular, and had developed its own network of blood vessels. "The size and complexity puts you at serious risk," Dr. Mitchell explained. "Infection, hemorrhage, possible malignancy. Edward, this needs immediate surgical intervention." "What kind of surgery?" Sarah asked. "This is beyond my expertise. I'm referring you to Dr. Patricia Sullivan at Regional Medical Center. She's the chief of surgery, specializes in complex cases." That evening, while Edward rested, Sarah explored the house. In the kitchen, she found a pill organizer with only every other day filled. Edward had been rationing his heart medication. In the study, she found a shoe box filled with medical bills he'd been ignoring. The most devastating discovery came in his jewelry box. Hidden underneath Margaret's watch, Sarah found a manila envelope containing $15,000 in cash. Edward's emergency fund, saved penny by penny. When she confronted him, Edward's response revealed his deepest fear. "That money is all that stands between me and the county nursing home. If I spend it on surgery and something else happens, what then?" The conversation stretched deep into the night. Sarah learned about the daily calculations her father made, choosing between air conditioning and groceries, delaying dental work, driving a car with bald tires. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked, her voice thick with guilt. Edward's answer cut to the heart of their relationship. "Because you built a life without me in it. You call on Christmas and my birthday. You haven't visited since your mother's funeral. What was I supposed to think?" Dr. Sullivan's office. The regional medical center loomed like a modern cathedral. Edward had dressed in his best outfit, a navy suit Margaret had always complimented and the dreaded cap arranged with precision. Dr. Patricia Sullivan's office walls were lined with diplomas and awards. When the doctor entered, Edward felt an odd sense of familiarity. "Mr. Hartford," Dr. Sullivan said, extending her hand. "Dr. Mitchell has briefed me. Before we begin, I need to understand the timeline. When did you first notice this growth?" "About 6 years ago. It started small. The last year it's been more aggressive." "Any family history of tumors or unusual growths?" "No, nothing like this." Edward paused. "Though I suppose there are things about family history I might not know." Something in Edward's tone made Dr. Sullivan look up sharply. "Any history of head trauma? Anything that might have caused injury to that area?" Edward's breath caught. "I know. I mean, nothing serious." "Mr. Hartford, I need to examine the area now." Edward's hands trembled as he removed the cap. The mass dominated the left side of his neck. The skin stretched tight, with visible blood vessels creating a web-like pattern. "How long since you've been able to sleep comfortably?" "I sleep in Margaret's recliner mostly." Dr. Sullivan's examination was thorough. "Mr. Hartford, this appears to be a complex cyst that has developed its own blood supply. We'll need MRI imaging before planning an approach." "What kind of surgery?" Sarah asked. "Major surgery. 6 to 8 hours, possibly. Extended recovery time. There are risks. The growth is close to major blood vessels and nerve pathways." "And the cost?" "With Medicare coverage, your out-of-pocket should be around $3,000, assuming no complications." Edward felt the room spinning. $3,000. "I need time to think," Edward said quietly. "Mr. Hartford," Dr. Sullivan's voice was gentle but firm, "I need you to understand something. This condition is not stable. There's increasing risk of rupture, infection, or worse. I strongly recommend we schedule surgery within 2 weeks." Walking to the car, Sarah voiced her frustration. "Dad, you have the money. Why are you hesitating?" Edward stopped in the parking lot. "That money represents 30 years of saving every penny. If I spend it on surgery and then need long-term care, I'll have nothing. But if you don't have the surgery, you might die. But at least I won't die poor and homeless." Edward's voice cracked. "You don't understand what it's like to be old and alone, Sarah. You have your career, health insurance, retirement accounts. I have a pension that barely covers utilities. Community support." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Frank Thompson arrived with 3 other neighbors, all carrying determined expressions. "Edward James Hartford," announced Dorothy Patterson, the church treasurer. "We need to talk." They'd organized what they called an intervention. "The whole town's talking about what happened at the Medicare meeting," said Betty Whitman. "And we've decided we're not letting pride kill our favorite hardware man." They'd contacted every family Edward had helped over his 40 years in business. The response had been overwhelming. "We've started a fund," Dorothy announced. "So far, we've raised $8,000. When word gets out to families who moved away." Edward burst into tears. "I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Frank said firmly. "It's gratitude. Do you have any idea how many people you've helped? Tommy Walsh told me you gave his family free supplies when his father lost his job. The Jenkins family said you carried them through 6 months of credit when Sarah was sick." The women had stories Edward had forgotten, small kindnesses that had seemed natural but had shaped lives in lasting ways. "The way we see it," Betty continued, "you've been making deposits in this community for 40 years. Now it's time to make a withdrawal." Cards arrived from across the country. Former customers who'd moved away, all carrying memories and checks to help with medical expenses. A Facebook page reached hundreds within days. The MRI results. Dr. Sullivan called with Edward's MRI results. "Mr. Hartford, I need you to come in immediately. The imaging shows something unexpected that changes our surgical approach." Edward's blood turned cold. "Is it cancer?" "No, not cancer. But there appears to be a foreign object embedded within the cyst structure. Something metallic. Do you have any memory of trauma to that area?" Edward's hand went to his throat. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "Mr. Hartford, are you there?" "Yes," Edward whispered. "Yes, I'm here. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" This finding significantly complicates the planning. After hanging up, Edward sat motionless. Sarah had never seen her father look so frightened. "Dad, what's wrong?" Edward turned to face his daughter. "Sarah, there are things about my life, about our family, that I've never told you. Things I hoped would stay buried forever." He paused. "But if they're going to cut me open and find, if they're going to discover things, you need to know the truth." The confession. "Before your mother, before Margaret, there was someone else. Someone I've spent 45 years trying to forget. His name was Thomas Miller, and I was in a relationship with him in 1979. Sarah, honey, if they find what I think they're going to find inside that growth, some very old questions are going to need new answers." Edward's confession hung in the air. Sarah sat frozen, struggling to process that there was an entire chapter of her father's life she'd never known existed. "Thomas Miller," Edward repeated. "I was 28 when I met him. We were business partners, started the hardware store together. Everyone in town thought we were just friends, but it was more than that." He stood slowly and walked to the window. "The relationship lasted 8 months. 8 months of hell that I've spent 45 years trying to forget." "What happened to him?" Sarah asked. Edward's hand went instinctively to his neck. "He disappeared. June 15th, 1979. One day he was there, and the next morning he was gone." "Disappeared? How?" The silence stretched. When Edward finally spoke, his words came out fractured. "Thomas had a drinking problem. He'd come home looking for fights, looking for reasons to—" He touched his neck. "Looking for reasons to hurt me." Sarah felt cold, understanding forming. "Dad, did he hit you?" "Hit me, pushed me through things. But it was 1979, Sarah. Domestic violence wasn't talked about, especially not between two men. Who would I have told? I tried to leave twice, but he'd find me. Promised to change." Edward returned to his chair. "The night he disappeared, we'd had the worst fight yet. I told him I was ending the partnership, moving away. He found the papers I'd been preparing. He came home drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him." "What happened then?" "He had this locket, a gold locket that had belonged to his mother. He'd given it to me as a gift. That night, when he was yelling, he grabbed it off my neck so hard the chain cut my skin. Then he threw it at my head. Hard." Edward pointed to where the growth dominated his neck. "It hit so hard I saw stars. Blood everywhere." Edward stood, pacing. I grabbed something to defend myself, a mirror from the dresser. When he came at me again, I swung it. I didn't mean to hurt him badly. I just wanted him to stop. But he was drunk, unsteady, and when the mirror hit him, he fell backward. The room had grown cold. Sarah realized she was holding her breath. He hit his head on the corner of the fireplace hearth. Made this awful sound, and then he was just still. He was dead. I thought so. There was blood. He wasn't moving. I was 28 years old, covered in my own blood, and the man who'd been terrorizing me was lying dead in our living room. "What did you do?" I panicked. I'd called the police once before when he'd beaten me, and they'd done nothing. Told me men don't have those kinds of problems. Thomas was well-respected, had friends everywhere. I was just the quiet partner. Who was going to believe me? Edward's story poured out now. I wrapped him in a tarp and drove him to the woods behind the old Miller property. Dug a grave and buried him there. Drove his truck to the bus station 3 towns over, left it there. When people asked, I said he'd abandoned the business and moved away. "And you never told anyone?" "In 45 years. Who was I going to tell?" By the time I met your mother 2 years later, I'd built an entire new life around the secret. Margaret was so kind, so gentle. How could I tell her I was a widower because I'd killed my first partner? Sarah ran her hands through her hair. "But Dad, it sounds like self-defense. You were being abused. That's not how it would have looked in 1979. Gay men didn't have legal protections. I would have been seen as a murderer, not a victim. My business would have been over. I would have gone to prison." "The locket," Sarah said suddenly. "You think the locket is what they found in the MRI?" Edward nodded. "When Thomas threw it at my head, it broke the skin deep. I remember pulling pieces of the chain out, but I was so panicked about everything else, I didn't think about whether all of it came out. So you've been carrying a piece of evidence for 45 years. And now they're going to cut you open and find it." Sarah moved to sit beside her father. "Dad, times have changed. Laws have changed. What you described isn't murder. It's self-defense. But Thomas is still buried in those woods. That hasn't changed. We'll deal with it, Sarah said firmly. Whatever happens, we'll deal with it together. You've carried this alone for too long. Edward looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in years. If this comes out, it could destroy everything. Your reputation, your career. I don't care about any of that. I care about you. I care that you've been living with this terror for my entire life. For the first time since his confession began, Edward allowed himself to cry. Deep, wrenching sobs from decades of suppressed fear and guilt. I never wanted you to know, he whispered. I wanted to protect you from all of it. Sarah held her father. So what do we do now? Now we go to surgery, Sarah said. We let Dr. Sullivan do what she needs to do. And if the past comes back to haunt us, we face it together. Surgery day. The morning of surgery arrived gray and cold. Edward sat in the preoperative waiting room, feeling like he was walking toward his own execution. Despite the community fundraising, despite Sarah's support, the locket was about to be removed after 45 years. Dr. Patricia Sullivan appeared in scrubs. Mr. Hartford, we're ready for you. The surgical team is prepared for the complications the foreign object might present. She paused, studying Edward's face with an odd familiarity. Are you ready? Edward nodded, though he felt anything but ready. Sarah squeezed his hand. I'll be right here when you wake up, Dad. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. As the anesthesia mask covered his face, Edward's last conscious thought was a prayer he'd been afraid to pray for decades. Please let the truth finally set me free. Dr. Sullivan began the procedure with confident precision. The growth was larger than anticipated, its blood supply more extensive. What should have been a 2-hour procedure stretched into the 4th hour. There's something here, Dr. Sullivan announced. Metallic, as expected, but there's more complexity than the imaging suggested. She carefully extracted what appeared to be a gold locket, tarnished but still recognizable. The surgical team fell silent. But that wasn't all. Embedded deeper, they found fragments of a mirror, small pieces that had somehow worked their way into the tissue. In 35 years of surgery, I've never seen anything like this, Dr. Sullivan murmured. These objects have been here for decades. The surgical resident studied the materials with fascination. The patient would have had to sustain significant trauma for objects to be embedded this deeply. Was there any history of accident or assault? Dr. Sullivan paused. Something about Edward Hartford had been nagging at her since their first meeting. The name, the age, the location. Dr. Sullivan, the anesthesiologist, called out. Patient's blood pressure is dropping. Edward was fighting the anesthesia, his body responding to deep psychological trauma. His vitals fluctuated wildly. As Dr. Sullivan worked to complete the surgery, Edward began speaking under anesthesia. Don't tell Margaret. Thomas is gone. Had to stop him. The mirror. So much blood. Dr. Sullivan's hand stilled. Thomas. The name triggered memory. Thomas Miller, her father, who had abandoned her and her mother when Patricia was 3, disappearing without explanation in 1979. The realization hit like electricity. Edward Hartford wasn't just a patient. He was connected to the central mystery of Patricia's childhood. Her father hadn't abandoned them. Something had happened to him. Something that involved this man. Dr. Sullivan, the resident, noticed her pause. Are you all right? Yes, I'm fine. Let's finish this procedure. But Patricia's mind was reeling. The timeline matched perfectly. Her father's disappearance in 1979. Edward's obvious trauma. The objects embedded in his neck. Pieces of a story that had haunted Patricia's entire life. Edward's surgery concluded successfully. All foreign objects were removed and documented. But for Dr. Sullivan, the medical procedure had raised more questions than it answered. She stared at the locket in its specimen container. She had seen this piece of jewelry before. In old family photographs her grandmother had shown her. This was her paternal grandmother's locket. If Edward Hartford had this locket embedded in his neck, if he had sustained trauma on the same timeline as Thomas Miller's disappearance, then Patricia was looking at evidence of what might have been her father's final moments. Dr. Sullivan called her grandmother, now 93. Grandma Rose, it's Patricia. I need to ask you about Dad, about Thomas. Do you remember the locket you gave him? Of course, dear. Beautiful piece. He said he was going to give it to that young man he was seeing, Edward something. Why do you ask? Patricia felt her world shifting. Grandma, what do you remember about Edward? About Dad's disappearance? Such a nice young man, that Edward. So sad what Thomas put him through. Thomas was drinking heavily those last months, coming home angry. Your grandfather always said he had his father's temper. Rose paused. The last time I saw them together, Edward had bruises on his arms. Made excuses, but I knew better. Did you ever suspect that Dad didn't just leave town? Honey, I always wondered. Thomas wasn't the type to just disappear. When he vanished, I figured something bad had happened. But the police weren't interested in investigating. After ending the call, Dr. Sullivan stood in the hospital corridor, grappling with the possibility that she had just operated on the man who might have killed her father. But strangely, she felt no anger, only understanding and relief. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had been stopped by someone defending himself. Recovery. Edward began waking from anesthesia as afternoon sun slanted through the recovery room windows. Sarah was at his bedside. The surgery went well, Dad, Sarah said softly. Dr. Sullivan removed everything. You're going to be fine. Edward's hand went to his neck, feeling the bandages. For the first time in 6 years, his neck felt normal. Did they find? They found it, Sarah confirmed. A locket and some other pieces. Dr. Sullivan has everything documented. Edward closed his eyes, feeling terror and relief. The evidence was out. What happens now? Before Sarah could answer, there was a soft knock. Dr. Sullivan entered, still in scrubs, carrying herself with careful composure. Mr. Hartford, how are you feeling? Like I've been carrying a weight I can finally put down, Edward answered honestly. Dr. Sullivan pulled up a chair. Mr. Hartford, I need to talk to you about what we found during surgery. But more than that, I need to talk to you about my father. About Thomas Miller. The words hung in the recovery room like a thunderclap. Edward's heart monitor began beeping rapidly. Mr. Hartford, I believe you knew my father. Thomas Miller disappeared in June 1979 when I was 3 years old. I've spent my entire life wondering what happened to him. Edward stared at Dr. Sullivan, seeing now what had been nagging at him. The shape of the eyes, the stubborn jaw. Patricia was Thomas Miller's daughter. Your little Patricia, Edward whispered. You were so small. You remember me? Dr. Sullivan's professional mask slipped, revealing the vulnerable child. Edward nodded. Your grandmother would bring you by the store sometimes. She'd always ask how the business was doing. Sarah looked between them. Dr. Sullivan she's Thomas's daughter? Yes, Edward said quietly. Dr. Sullivan leaned forward. Mr. Hartford, I need to know the truth about what happened to my father. The locket we removed, it belonged to my great-grandmother. How did it end up embedded in your tissue? The silence stretched for eternity. Edward looked at Sarah, then at Patricia. Patricia! Honey, Edward began, his voice trembling. What do you remember about your father? Very little. I was only 3, but my grandmother told me stories. She said he was troubled, that he drank too much, that he had a temper. Patricia studied Edward's reaction. She also said that after he started seeing you, he seemed to get worse. Your grandmother was right. Thomas was not well. The drinking made him angry, violent. Edward touched his bandaged neck. He hurt me many times. He hurt you, Patricia said. Not a question, but medical fact. Yes. The night he disappeared, we'd had the worst fight. I told him I was ending our partnership. He came home drunk and enraged. He grabbed the locket from my neck, breaking the chain, cutting my skin. Then he threw it at my head. Patricia felt her medical training take over. The force would have had to be significant to embed it that deeply. It hit hard enough to split the skin. But that wasn't the worst part. Edward looked directly at Patricia. When I tried to defend myself, I grabbed a mirror. When he came at me again, I swung it at him. Edward's voice broke. He was drunk, unsteady. When the mirror hit him, he fell backward and struck his head on the fireplace hearth. There was so much blood. He wasn't moving. Patricia sat in stunned silence. I was 28 years old, terrified, and I panicked. I'd called the police before when he'd beaten me, and they'd done nothing. Thomas was well respected, and I was just his partner. Who would have believed me? So you buried him, Patricia said quietly. Edward nodded. In the woods behind the old Miller property. I wrapped him up, drove him there, buried him. Then left his truck at the bus station to make it look like he'd left town. The recovery room fell silent except for Edward's monitors. Patricia stared at her hands, processing the revelation. Dr. Sullivan, Sarah said carefully. What does this mean legally? For my father. Patricia looked up. Mr. Hartford, I need you both to understand something. I became a surgeon partly because I wanted to help people heal from trauma. I've seen hundreds of domestic violence cases, and I understand the dynamics in ways that weren't understood in 1979. She stood and walked to the window. What your father describes sounds like textbook self-defense during a domestic violence assault. The pattern of abuse, the escalation, the victim's fear for his life. These are all factors courts recognize today. Edward felt hope mixed with terror. But I buried the body. I hid evidence. You were a traumatized abuse victim who had no faith in the system's ability to protect you, Patricia replied. And based on what my grandmother told me about how domestic violence was handled in 1979, especially involving same-sex relationships, your fear was justified. Patricia returned to her chair. Mr. Hartford, I need to tell you something. I wonder my entire life what happened to my father. Part of me hoped he was alive somewhere. But another part, the part that remembered my grandmother's careful words about his drinking and temper, suspected something terrible had happened. Edward searched Patricia's face for hatred but found neither. I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't change anything. Mr. Hartford, do you remember what you used to tell children who came into your store when they'd broken something accidentally? You'd say, mistakes happen when we're scared. What matters is what we do next. Edward nodded, remembering those conversations. I forgave my father years ago for abandoning me, Patricia continued. Now I understand he didn't abandon me. He was stopped by someone defending himself. In a strange way, that's easier to forgive. The three of them sat in the growing shadows. What happens now? Edward asked finally. Patricia considered carefully. Now you heal from surgery. The tissue samples will show chronic inflammation consistent with old trauma. The locket and mirror fragments will be documented as foreign objects removed during a medical procedure. She paused. As for the other matter, that's between us. My father's case was closed decades ago as a missing person. There's no active investigation. No one looking for answers except me. And I have my answer now. Edward reached out and took Patricia's hand. You saved my life today. Patricia squeezed Edward's hand. We saved each other. And today, I was able to help you finally let go of a secret that was literally killing you. As evening fell, three people sat together, bound by tragedy, but choosing healing over hatred, understanding over vengeance, and hope over the sins of the past. 3 months later, Edward Hartford stood in front of his bedroom mirror for the first time in 6 years without immediately turning away. The surgical scar had healed to a thin pink line. More importantly, the weight he'd carried was finally gone. For the first time since 1979, Edward slept through the night without nightmares. He ate meals at his kitchen table. Most remarkably, he had begun to laugh again. Sarah had moved back to Millfield, opening a small family practice. The city was exhausting, she told Edward, and I realized how much of my own life I'd been missing by staying away. Dr. Patricia Sullivan had become a regular presence in Edward's life. Though their relationship had evolved beyond doctor and patient, Patricia visited monthly, and they spent their time talking about healing, about the strange circularity of their connected lives. During one visit, Patricia brought photo albums from her grandmother's house. I thought you might like to see these. The albums contained pictures of Thomas as a child, showing signs of anger that would later consume him. But there were also pictures of him as a young man, when he still smiled genuinely. Your grandmother told me once that Thomas's father was a violent man, Edward said quietly. She said the drinking started after his father died. Patricia nodded. Grandmother Rose always said trauma runs in families until someone decides to break the cycle. I think in a terrible way, you broke it for both of us. Thomas couldn't have been a father to me, not with his demons. The conversation led to a decision that surprised them both. Edward asked Patricia if she would consider having Thanksgiving dinner together with Sarah and Patricia's own family. It seems fitting that we should be grateful together for the strange ways life brings people back to each other. The Thanksgiving gathering became a new tradition. Patricia's husband and their 2 young children simply accepted Edward as Dr. Mom's friend and delighted in his stories. Edward found himself naturally falling back into his mentor role, helping with homework and teaching the children about tools and building things. The most profound healing came through Edward's decision to begin speaking publicly about domestic violence in LGBTQ relationships. Patricia had connected him with regional organizations where Edward's story resonated powerfully with current victims of abuse. Staying alive and staying safe are more important than staying quiet, Edward would tell groups. I carried shame for 45 years. I thought protecting myself made me a killer. But I learned that sometimes survival requires actions we never thought we'd be capable of. The measure of our worth isn't in the terrible things that happen to us. It's in how we choose to heal and help others heal. His talks drew standing ovations, but more importantly, they drew people who approached him afterward with their own stories, their own fears about leaving dangerous situations. Sarah watched her father's transformation with amazement. The man who had spent years hiding was now traveling throughout Ohio, speaking to audiences of hundreds about courage and survival. You know what's funny? Edward said one evening, I spent 45 years thinking I was running from my past, but I was actually running toward my purpose. Every customer I helped, every difficult situation I navigated, it was all preparation for this. The most unexpected development came when Patricia proposed starting a foundation addressing both domestic violence and long-term health impacts of trauma. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, Patricia said during one of their monthly visits. Something that addresses both domestic violence and the long-term health impacts of trauma. I'd like you to be the co-founder and primary spokesperson. Edward was quiet for a long moment. That would mean going fully public with the story. Everything. Yes, it would. But Edward, think about the people who are carrying secrets like you carried yours. Think about the victims who think they have no options, no voice, no value. You could show them that survival is possible, that healing is possible, that building a meaningful life after trauma is possible. The Hartford Sullivan Foundation for Trauma Recovery launched 6 months later with a mission statement that reflected both their journeys, helping survivors transform their pain into purpose, their secrets into strength, and their shame into service. Edward's first major interview with a national magazine generated hundreds of letters from readers sharing their own stories of abuse, survival, and recovery. The Foundation's website crashed from traffic within hours of the article's publication. Perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The current owner of what had been Hartford Hardware contacted Edward to announce that the renovated store would feature a community space named in his honor, the Edward Hartford Resource Center, focusing on creating safe spaces for LGBTQ youth and domestic violence survivors. At the dedication ceremony, attended by hundreds of people spanning 4 decades, Edward stood before the crowd that had once known him only as their friendly hardware store owner. Now they knew him as something more complex and more inspiring. A survivor who had chosen courage over comfort, truth over silence, and service over self-protection. 45 years ago, Edward told the gathered crowd, I made a choice to protect myself from violence. Today, I make a choice to protect others by sharing my story. Both choices required courage I didn't know I possessed. But here's what I've learned. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's teaching others to be brave by showing them what survival looks like. Patricia sat in the front row with her children, watching the man who had forever changed her understanding of her father's disappearance, now teaching an entire community about resilience and redemption. In her purse, she carried a small jewelry box containing the restored locket, cleaned, polished, and fitted with a new chain. After the ceremony, she planned to give it to Edward, transformed from evidence of trauma into a symbol of survival. As Edward concluded his speech, he looked out over the faces of people whose lives he had touched as a shopkeeper, a mentor, a survivor, and now as an advocate. He thought about the scared young man who had buried a secret in the woods 45 years ago, never imagining that one day he would stand before hundreds of people unashamed and unafraid. The young man who had dreamed of running a hardware store to help people fix their homes had indeed spent his life helping others. But the most important lesson he had learned, and could now teach others, was that it's never too late to stop hiding from your own life and start living it with purpose, courage, and hope. In the end, Edward realized the secret that had nearly killed him had also saved him, leading him to exactly where and who he was meant to be. Reflection. Edward's story reminds us that the secrets we carry to protect ourselves often become the very chains that imprison us. At 74, he discovered that the shame he'd hidden for 45 years wasn't his burden to bear alone. It was his strength to share with others. How many of us have spent decades believing that our past mistakes, our survival choices, or our moments of human frailty define our worth? Edward thought protecting himself from an abusive partner made him unworthy of love, undeserving of peace. He lived as a prisoner in his own home, hiding from a world that actually needed his wisdom. But when he finally found the courage to speak his truth, he discovered something powerful. Our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts to others. The very experiences that made him feel broken were exactly what other people needed to hear to find their own strength. At any age, we can choose to stop hiding from our stories and start using them to heal ourselves and others. Your past doesn't disqualify you from happiness. It qualifies you to help others find theirs. What secret have you been carrying that might actually be someone else's lifeline? When did you last choose courage over comfort? And how did it change your life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters more than you know.